So Marx claims that the active side was developed by idealism, but he doesn't say how he arrived at this claim, at least not explicitly. As we've probably already seen when we tried to locate his chief defect of materialism, this is going to come up fairly often in the thesis on Feuerbach. And we should keep in mind that Marx was primarily writing this text for himself rather than for an audience as part of his self-clarification. So we may need to do a little bit of detective work in order to get a sense of what Marx has in mind here. It's definitely very tempting to want to start by defining idealism, since we really haven't talked much about idealism. We've talked a lot more about materialism so far. And since idealism is really an umbrella term, it can mean quite a few different things, we'll definitely want to get a sense of what Marx means by idealism in this text. But actually, where I want us to draw our attention first, before we even get into that, is to this word developed. The word choice here is kind of interesting. We're getting this word from translators. Obviously, Marx was writing in German, and we're getting this word from the German entwickelt, which can mean developed, sure. Can also mean produced, generated, evolved. With developed, and I'm not a translation expert, I'm not an expert on the German language. I'm sure translators had a reason for choosing this word, but I think it's a little bit easy to be misled by this word into thinking that Marx is saying that idealists had the goal of developing an active side, like they set out to accomplish this like as a task. And on the other hand, that materialists had as an explicit goal to preclude this notion of an active side. And that wouldn't be correct, nor do I think that's what Marx is saying. If we thought about it in terms of developed, like, like an artist develops a sculpture, or an author develops a work, a composer develops a piece of music, there's some intention there. There's a thinking subject, which would be very strange for Marx to apply to idealism, since that's definitely an aspect of idealism that he would reject, this personification of ideologies and philosophies and schools of thought. But with other words like produced, generated, evolved, these are a little bit more, these kind of leave out that problem, right? Because you can say like a lamp generates heat, but we know that a lamp doesn't have a mind. It's not choosing to generate heat. It's just it happens as a consequence of what a lamp is, of what a flame is. It's giving off energy, but it doesn't have to put thought into that. It doesn't have to plan to do that. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because that is precisely the way in which Marx means idealism developed the active side. He doesn't mean that idealism set out a list of tasks to accomplish and developing an active side was one of them. Rather, he means that this notion of an active side was able to emerge from within the scheme of reality and of the mind that idealists sketched. Whereas, on the other hand, it was precluded by the way in which materialists sketched reality and the mind. So there's something in the way that idealism views the mind in particular, which seems to allow for the emergence of this notion of an active side. And I hope the distinction and the importance of making that distinction is clear, because for Marx to say that idealists deliberately set out to establish this active side in their sketch of reality, that would be ahistorical, and it would also be anthropomorphizing a school of thought, which is definitely would not be characteristic of someone like Karl Marx. So idealism, as the term is used in philosophy, can actually refer to two broad sets of viewpoints rather than one single school of thought. And we can distinguish between these two sets by the types of claims that they each make. So there's one sense of idealism that makes claims about reality, about what makes up reality, about what exists. So it's concerned with metaphysical questions, makes metaphysical claims. On this view, reality is either composed of or confined to something mental or spiritual. And if that sounds kind of vague, that's okay. That's part of what Marx detested a lot about idealism, was its vagaries. One school of thought is that reality quite literally is in our minds, that there is no external world. This is a form of idealism typically associated with the Scottish philosopher George Berkeley. There's another sense of this school of thought in which reality is not confined to our minds, but its fundamental makeup is some spiritual essence or entity. So we may hear things like it's all energy, or it's all God, or it's all Brahman, or it's all the Tao. There's some spiritual essence or entity that underpins all of reality, and at its core, everything just is this essence, which is to say that at its core, reality is not material. On the surface, things might look like they're material. Like if you look at Hinduism, if you look at the Vedantic scriptures, about the way that they, especially the Upanishads, and you look at the way they talk about how things appear to be corporeal, but that's all an illusion, that underneath it all, it's all Brahman. And you find kind of similar language within Taoism, within the Tao Te Ching. They talk about the myriad of things and the manifest, but that ultimately it really all comes down to the Tao. So obviously there's some connection between idealism and religious worldviews, but we shouldn't be misled to think that all religions are idealist. They're not, or that all idealists are religious, which also wouldn't be true. But there's obviously some correlation. In either case, whether the mind is what's deluding us to think that there's an external world, it's all in our mind, or whether at its core, reality is some kind of spiritual substance or entity, either way, there's no material world. There's no materiality. So this second sense of idealism is concerned with the mind, with knowledge, with how we get knowledge, what kind of knowledge we're able to have access to about the world. And on this view, the external worlds, the world outside of our minds, even a material world, is really not denied. It's assented to that there is a world that actually exists, but what this school of thought of idealism maintains is that we can never actually have direct access to the world as it actually is. And this has something to do with our minds. Now, this can sound very negative and very limiting, but from Marx's point of view, this is actually quite liberating in at least one sense, because what this means is that because of the way our minds are structured in such a way that they interpret reality, they perceive information coming to us from the world, and they represent it to us in certain ways. They represent it to us, which is an active process. So, when our minds are the things that shape how we perceive reality, what we get to say here is that our minds play an active role in that process rather than a passive one. In materialism, our minds just sort of intake the information. They don't structure it in any particular way. They don't interpret it in any particular way. It just comes and goes. And in this particular school of thought within idealism, which had actually only emerged maybe half a century before Marx would be writing the thesis on Feuerbach, which we'll get to shortly, on this view, it seems to allow for an active mind rather than a passive one. One of the examples that I was taught in trying to explain this sketch of the mind is to think about colors. This may come as a shock, but colors aren't real. Colors don't actually exist in the world. What exists is light and light waves and certain properties of certain materials that cause some light to be reflected, some to be absorbed, light to be to go through these changes in how fast the waves are going or how spread out the waves are. Um, that is happening. All of that is happening. But we don't actually see that. What we see is something we call color. The other way to look at it is to think about a camera. You know, the lens on a camera, whether it's a really, really good quality lens or whether it's a specific kind of lens, like a wide scope or a telescope lens, will shape the way that the camera captures an image. It's not actually changing what the camera is taking a picture of. That would be absurd. But it is making a difference in how that image is being captured and then represented to us when we, if we have like a digital camera and we take a picture and then we look at the picture that we just took on a little screen, the kind of lens that we use is gonna shape how that image comes out. And that's what our mind is doing. So in this sense, Marx appears to think that constitutes something active.